For millions of us, the nightly Taraweeh prayer is just a core part of Ramadan, right? It's that beautiful communal experience. But what if I told you that the way it's commonly practiced today, in one large congregation, might not be how the Prophet originally did it? In this explainer, we're going to dig into the history, deconstructing the origins of this prayer, tracing its journey based directly on the historical sources and the theological debates that surround it. So, how are we going to tackle this? Well, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at a really puzzling gap in its history. Then, we'll dive into the Prophet's own, very clear instructions on the matter. After that, we'll pinpoint the exact moment the practice changed, look at the arguments used to defend that change, and finally, weigh all the evidence to get to the heart of this whole debate. Is it a sunnah or an innovation? All right, let's jump right in with a bit of a paradox. You see, the way Taraweeh is often talked about today seems to clash with its own early history. And it all boils down to one very specific, very important religious term. That term is Sunnah Mu'akkadah. So what does that actually mean? Well, think of it as an emphasized practice. It's an action so important that many scholars will tell you that to deliberately skip it is actually a sin. So yeah, that really raises the stakes, doesn't it? And this brings us to our first major historical puzzle. If this congregational prayer is so emphasized that missing it is a sin, then you have to ask, why does it seem to be completely missing in action during the entire leadership of the first Caliph, Abu Bakr? It's a huge historical gap that really needs some explaining. This timeline right here, it just lays out the whole issue so clearly. During the Prophet's lifetime, and then under the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, the practice was individual. People prayed alone. But then, under the second Caliph, Umar, boom, everything changes. So to understand why that shift was so significant, we need to go back to the very beginning. Okay, so let's go straight to the source, the Prophet himself. What was the original way of doing things? And maybe more importantly, how did he react when his followers actually tried to turn this private prayer into a public spectacle? The sources describe a really direct and pretty strong response. When his companions gathered behind him for this optional night prayer, he didn't just encourage it. The narrations say he would actually interrupt his own prayer, sit down, tell them to leave the mosque, and even showed anger that they kept insisting. And all of this built up to one very clear command. And this quote from Sahih al-Bukhari really spells it out, doesn't it? Pray in your houses, for the best prayer of a person is in his house, except for the obligatory prayers. It draws a very clear line in the sand. The obligatory, required prayers are for the mosque. But the best place for your optional prayers? That's at home. This is the foundational instruction that this entire debate really hinges on. So if the Prophet's own instruction was to pray at home, how in the world did we get to the huge, organized congregational prayers we see in mosques today? Well, that question leads us to a pivotal moment, a major shift that happened during the leadership of the second Caliph, Umar. The historical records, like this one from Sahih al-Bukhari, are actually quite specific. Umar walks into the mosque. He sees people praying, but they're all over the place. Some are alone, some are in little scattered groups. And he's the one who decides, okay, let's organize this. He appoints a single imam and gathers everyone into one single congregation. It was a clear, top-down administrative change. Now, those who critique this change use a very specific theological term for it, bid'ah. In an Islamic context, this is a big deal. It means an innovation in matters of religion, basically introducing something that the Prophet himself didn't do. And this label isn't applied to the prayer itself, but to this new congregational form of the prayer. Of course, a change this significant doesn't happen without some justifications. So how is this shift defended by those who support it? And what are the counter-arguments from the sources? Let's get into the debate. All right, the most common defense you'll hear is that the Prophet only stopped the congregation out of mercy. He was worried that if he kept doing it, God might make this really tough prayer obligatory on everyone. But the counter-argument is pretty straightforward. The number of obligatory prayers was permanently set at 5 during the Prophet's night journey. So from a theological standpoint, adding a new obligatory prayer was simply not possible. And this brings up what looks like a major contradiction. The idea that the Prophet avoided doing something consistently to stop it from becoming mandatory, well, it seems to fly directly in the face of his own teachings, which are also recorded in Bukhari, that the deeds God loves most are the ones you do consistently, even if they're small. Okay,
The second big defense leans on a hadith that says to follow the way of the Prophet and his rightly guided caliphs. The argument is that their actions also set a precedent we should follow. The challenge to this, though, questions the premise, citing other instances where Umar was reportedly unaware of basic religious rulings, like how to perform dry ablution or tayammum.
So, after walking through the original practice, the big shift, and the arguments back and forth, what's the conclusion from this critical point of view? Where does the evidence point? So let's just recap the argument one more time. The Prophet's own practice was praying individually at home. He actively shut down attempts to make it a group prayer. The congregational format we all know was an administrative decision made by the Caliph Umar. And the justifications for that decision face some pretty serious challenges. The conclusion from this perspective, therefore, is that the congregational form of Taraweeh is an innovation, a bid'ah, and not the original prophetic Sunnah. And this all leaves us with one final, really thought-provoking question to chew on. When a religious practice evolves over time, where does its ultimate authority come from? Does it come from the original precedent set by the Prophet himself, or from the administrative decisions made by leaders who came after him? That's the core question.